Hi and welcome. These are a series of notes on Michel Makarius' book titled Ruins. The book focuses on visual art's relationship to and depictions of ruins mainly within Western culture. I'll take a focused look on concepts and ideas that seemed interesting within the third chapter of the text. However, I won't go through all of the content within the chapter itself. If you find the content in this recording interesting, you're welcome to follow along as I create a new one for each section. I'll also have a link to the book itself in the description. The section I'll take a look at is titled A Season in the Ruins. This chapter is a bit short, but deals with some interesting topics. It moves the narrative forward a bit in time, mostly to the 1600s. During this time, there's a shift in representation with regards to the Mannerists, from ruin as an environmental shift with constant change and degradation to an environment that is in many ways lived with. There are several positions tied to this that we'll go throughout the section, some of which challenge or counter each other. A good way of describing many of these movements is a shift in representation towards more pastoral life. There's a statement within the text on page 64 that's quite wonderful and accurate for this change in representation that was happening in the 1600s. It reads as such: An outsider is more sensitive to a landscape he is discovering for the first time than one who has been surrounded by it since childhood. Many of the artists that are discussed throughout this section are originally from regions outside of Italy, particularly from the north and west. Of course, there are always exceptions to these statements, but the general trend or pattern is as such. This shift in representations of ruins can first be attributed to the Flemish painter Paul Bril. Born in Antwerp, he was a painter and printmaker known for his landscapes, with most of his career centered in Rome. His paintings had a strong influence on landscape painters in Italy and Northern Europe. Originally, he was painting in the style of the Mannerists that was developed within the Flemish tradition that often depicted picturesque landscapes with high contrast between light and dark space, to provide a sense of motion within the visual field. While visiting Rome, he shifted his style of painting to one that was more classic in nature as he expanded his career and was also exposed to new influences. This included the more realistic positioning within his paintings, moving a bit away from the idea of a shifting landscape to a more lived-in and calmer one. What's also important about him is that he began the genre called the composite vedute, or veduta. The veduta is considered a highly detailed, usually large-scale work of art of a cityscape or other sort of vista. These representations also seem to be very realistic in representation. Another important artist to consider, given this move towards the pastoral and bucolic, is Nicolas Poussin. The book gives a wonderful positioning for his work on pages 64 and 67. Painting is nothing else but an idea of incorporeal things. Nicolas Poussin's own definition explains why his ruins are abstract forms rather than traces of time or history. Poussin's ruin is not an architecture laid waste whose remnants are set forth in a picture. It exists in the price of its presence and not in the melancholy of endurance. An idea of architecture, an essence that happens to appear as a vestige. The great 17th century painter is not trying to restitute the reality of a view. He aims at an ideal, a recomposed landscape in which nature's elaborate compositions. Poussin builds up the image through a process of formal geometrization, vegetal structure, sculptural pose, rhetorical gesture. Each component of the scene fends off reality. In this ideal landscape, nature and culture are finely balanced, coupled in a harmonious totality. Such is the theoretical basis of the ideal landscape, of which Poussins are the supreme examples. The aim, then, is not unattainable realism, but to locate the scene in a place of myth. The task for Poussin is to discover, through the ruins of art, the inverted barrels of columns, the pedestals, the dressed ashlar and blocks, an architecture of the visible world, nature as architect. It's also worth spending a moment talking about the genre of Capriccio. Initially designated as bizarre images featuring monstrous or composite figures, as well as ornamental motifs. The term capriccio or caprice indicated, at least originally, a piece of music that was meant to be relatively unbound by formal constraints on sheet music. In general, it comes from the imagination rather than representation of reality or representation of an ideal, and isn't something one would normally see or encounter. Examples of this might include Hieronymus Bosch or even Gothic architecture. Within Chapter 3, there's also short discussion about a group called the Bombocianti. They painted everyday life of working class and poor people among ruins. Although the movement by this group was seen with disdain by other artists and critics, it was very popular among aristocratic and middle-class circles at the time. I felt that the book defined this quite eloquently on page 76 as such. The genre was a realism that dealt with the poorest of the poor. Its origins hark back to the Caravaggio revolution that consisted, in addition to its novel use of lighting effects, in taking its models from the street to increase the viewer's empathy with the figures, even in religious scenes. A whole disinherited social stratum, ignored until they were thus herded into the hallowed portals of art by artists. The ruin, by becoming a natural shelter for those with no fixed abode, shakes off its historical connotations and shows itself for what it is, a place abandoned, as miserable as those who dwell within it. This social realism, as first cousin to the Dutch genre scene, and thus focuses on the lower orders rather than an upper-class idealization. Well, that's it for section 3 of Makarius's book, Ruins. If you like this content, please like, comment, and subscribe. Thanks for listening.